It is Monday, February 23rd, 2026. And if you've been following the headlines over the weekend, you know that Washington just went through, well, basically a legal and economic earthquake.
Yeah, that's not an overstatement. It is historic.
Yeah.
We're basically looking at a massive Supreme Court ruling regarding trade policy that it flipped the whole board over.
Right. And we are calling this Tariff Strategy 2.0. So for this deep dive, we've got a massive stack of sources. We're looking at the actual Supreme Court opinions, a bunch of really dense economic strategy reports, and some legal analysis on the transition away from this old IEPA framework to something entirely new.
Exactly. And the new strategy is basically what analysts are calling a legal fortress. It's wild stuff.
It really is. So our mission today is to decode all of this. We want to figure out how a court ruling in D.C. actually turns into a price hike for you, the listener. And we also need to explain why an obscure law from 1974 is suddenly like the most important thing in the global economy.
Right, because there's this weird paradox here. Usually when the government loses in court on a big overreach, the public wins. But in this case,
the public is probably going to end up paying the bill.
Yeah, twice, actually. And there's a potential $140 billion wealth transfer wrapped up in this mess.
Insane. Okay, let's start with the trigger event. Section 1, the collapse of IEPA. This happened last Friday, February 20th. We had a 6-3 Supreme Court decision that struck down the use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, for broad tariffs.
Yeah, and the context here is super important because for a long time, IEPA was the administration's absolute favorite weapon for unilateral trade policy.
Which is strange, right? Because I always understood IEPA as the tool for, targeted sanctions like freezing the bank accounts of drug cartels or rogue states.
Exactly, it was a scalpel. But recently, it was repurposed into a sledgehammer. The administration essentially argued that trade deficits, or the flow of drugs across the border, constituted a quote-unquote national emergency.
And once you use the magic word emergency?
Right. Suddenly the president gets these sweeping powers to regulate commerce without having to go through Congress. It's a very convenient workaround.
Because getting a tariff bill through the House and Senate is messy and slow.
Right. So they just hit the easy button.
Yeah.
But the Supreme Court finally stepped in and said, no, you can't do that. It's unconstitutional.
So why exactly did it fail in court?
A few reasons. First, the 6-3 ruling leaned heavily on the lack of precedent. The court pointed out that in the 50-year history of IEPA, no president had ever tried to use it for tariffs on this massive global scale.
Yeah, the sources really highlighted that. It was totally unprecedented.
And second, it was deemed an unconstitutional use of delegated authority. The Constitution very clearly gives the power to tax and set tariffs to Congress. The court basically said you can't stretch the definition of an emergency to cover normal socioeconomic issues.
Like losing a trade war might be bad for the economy, but it's not a sudden emergency like a military invasion.
Exactly. They flat out rejected the emergency argument.
Which triggered quite a reaction. I saw in the sources the former president immediately put out a statement telling the judges they should, quote, feel ashamed.
Yeah, the political fallout was immediate. But practically what this does is create a massive legal barrier. You can no longer just use an executive order to push through broad protectionist policies. The easy button is gone.
Which brings us to this $140 billion headache, Section 2 of our dive. If those tariffs were illegal, that means the government collected billions of dollars in taxes it technically wasn't allowed to collect.
That's right. The foundation completely evaporated. So now we're looking at possibly the largest tax refund situation in American history. $140 billion.
Okay, but we need to be really clear here for the listener. This refund is not going to the average person who paid, say, an extra $20 for a coffee maker at the store.
No, absolutely not. The money goes to the importer of record.
The importer of record. So who exactly is lining up for this cash?
The sources list about 2,000 different companies. We're talking massive retailers like Costco, Staples, Barnes & Noble, huge fashion brands like Prada and J.Crew, and major manufacturers too. Toyota, Goodyear Tire, GoPro.
That is a wild list of companies.
Yeah, they are the ones who filed the paperwork at customs, so legally they're the ones who get the refund.
Okay, so the economic reports we read called this a robbery in plain sight. Walk me through that mechanism, because if I bought a TV during the trade war, the price was inflated by that tariff.
Right. When the tariffs hit, those companies didn't just eat the cost. They raised their prices at the register. So you, the consumer, actually paid the tariff out of your pocket.
But Costco or Best Buy took my money, paid the government, And now the government is giving that money back to the company.
Exactly.
Do they have to refund me?
Nope. There is zero legal obligation for them to track you down and send you a check for that extra markup. The transaction with you is over.
So it's just a pure wealth transfer.
It really is. It's a transfer of wealth straight from the middle class, who absorb those higher prices right onto corporate balance sheets.
A reverse Robin Hood.
Exactly.
Right.
And the government already spent that original tariff revenue. It's gone. So to pay out this $140 billion refund, the Treasury will probably have to issue more debt, which adds to the deficit.
Wow. Okay, so the administration gets slapped down by the Supreme Court, and they accidentally trigger a massive corporate payout. You would think they might pause and rethink their trade strategy.
You would think, but politically, they can't afford to look soft on trade. So instead of pausing, they are aggressively pivoting. They're launching a stopgap measure to keep the tariffs flowing while they figure out a permanent fix.
Right, and this brings us to Section 3, the bridge strategy. They dug up Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974.
Yes, the 1974 Trade Act.
Which is fascinating because 1974 is the Nixon era. We're talking about a completely different economic universe. Why use this specific law?
Because it's practically the only tool left in the toolbox that doesn't require asking Congress for permission. Section 122 allows the president to impose a flat 15% global tariff.
Global, meaning they can't target a specific country like China with this one?
Right. It has to be applied to everyone equally. And the other catch is that it can only last for a maximum of 150 days. That's why we're calling it a bridge.
Okay, but the legal justification for Section 122 is what the economic analysts in our sources are calling zombie economics.
That's the perfect term for it. To use Section 122, the administration has to declare that the U.S. is facing a balance of payments crisis.
Which sounds serious, but what does that actually mean today versus in 1974?
It's night and day. In 1974, the world was just transitioning off the gold standard. Back then, if you had a massive trade deficit, meaning you were importing way more than you exported, there was a real risk that foreign countries would demand to be paid in actual gold.
Meaning a trade deficit literally drained the national wealth.
Exactly. That is a real balance of payments crisis. But today, we live in a modern fiat currency system with flexible exchange rates.
We aren't shipping bars of gold to cover our electronics imports.
No, we pay in U.S. dollars. And because the dollar is the global reserve currency, those dollars don't just vanish into a void. They are recycled.
Recycled how?
When a foreign country gets our dollars, they usually turn around and reinvest them right back into the U.S. economy. They buy U.S. Treasury bonds, they buy stocks, they buy real estate. So the dollars leaving via the trade deficit come right back through the capital account.
So a true balance of payments crisis is practically impossible for the U.S. today.
Right. So using a 1974 law designed to protect gold reserves to fight a modern trade war is a huge legal stretch. It's totally zombie economics.
And the legal experts we reviewed all seem to agree this is super risky. It's essentially just a delay tactic. They're buying time, and it's highly likely this will also get struck down by the courts eventually.
Keyword being eventually.
Right, because 150 days of a global 15% tariff is going to cause a lot of chaos while it's active.
Huge chaos. Because remember, it's global. You're hitting allies, Canada, the EU, Japan, and they will retaliate. But the administration is willing to take that risk to buy those 150 days.
Which leads us to the ultimate destination. Section 4, the long game. If Section 122 is just the temporary bridge, where's the bridge taking us?
It's taking us to the bureaucratic fortress, Section 301.
Okay, so Section 301 is also part of trade law, but it operates very differently from the executive orders we saw with IEPA.
Entirely differently. IEPA was fast. It was an overnight executive action. Section 301 is a grind. It requires months and months of formal investigation, gathering evidence, holding hearings.
Which actually works to their advantage now, right? Because it creates a massive paper trail.
That is the whole point of the fortress strategy. When you take months to build a case, gathering thousands of pages of economic data, it becomes incredibly difficult for a court to strike it down. The administration can walk into court and say, look, we didn't just declare an emergency out of thin air. We have a mountain of evidence proving unfair trade practices.
So what exactly are they investigating with Section 301? What's the target?
The main target is dumping.
Explain dumping for us, because the sources outlined a very specific cycle of how this kills competition.
Sure. Dumping is when a foreign competitor sells their products in the U.S. below the actual cost of making them.
So they're intentionally taking a loss.
Yes, and they do that to starve out U.S. manufacturers. The cycle goes like this. The foreign company floods the market with cheap, subsidized goods. The American competitor can't match those artificially low prices, so they go bankrupt.
And once the American company is dead, the foreign company has a monopoly.
Exactly. And step 4, once they have the monopoly, they jack the prices way up.
So the administration wants to use Section 301 to specifically target and penalize those dumping practices. But building those cases takes a long time.
It usually takes a year or more, but they're trying to speedrun it. The strategy is to use the 150-day window of the Section 122 global tariff to hold the line, effectively freezing the market, while they frantically build these bulletproof Section 301 cases in the background.
So by the time the courts finally get around to striking down the 1974 zombie law, the new permanent 301 tariffs will be ready to deploy.
That's the fortress. They are layering these legal defenses so that they don't get caught empty-handed again.
It's a pretty remarkable piece of bureaucratic maneuvering. But let's bring this all back to the bottom line for the listener, because all this legal maneuvering, whether it's IEPA, Section 122, or Section 301, it feels like a massive shell game.
It is a shell game. They're just moving the justification around, but the end result for the consumer doesn't change.
Right. The immediate impact of this new bridge strategy is that prices on imported goods are going to rise by at least 15% immediately.
Immediately. And that touches almost everything you buy, from groceries to electronics to cars.
And we really need to debunk a major political myth here, because you hear this all the time. The idea that tariffs are paid by foreign countries.
It's completely false. China does not write a check to the U.S. Treasury. The tariff is paid by the American importer at the port, and then that cost is passed directly on to you, the consumer. Tariffs are essentially a national consumption tax.
There was also that talking point about using tariffs to replace the income tax.
The math simply does not support that. There is absolutely no income tax cut coming to offset this 15% price hike.
So just to summarize the sheer scale of the chaos we've decoded today, we had an illegal tariff scheme that collected billions. The court struck it down. Now we have a $140 billion corporate payout that the public will ultimately fund through national debt. And to replace the old tariffs, we are getting a new 15% price hike across the board.
It's a brutal combination for the average household.
Which brings us to a final, really provocative thought to end on today. The sources kind of alluded to this, but when you step back and look at the whole picture, the dynamic is deeply unsettling.
It really is. We are basically watching a system where legal mistakes made by the government result in massive windfalls for huge corporations. But the average citizen, they end up paying the bill twice.
First at the cash register when the prices went up originally.
Exactly. And potentially again through the national deficit when the government has to borrow money to issue those $140 billion in corporate refunds.
It's a heavy thought to sit with. Next time you are shopping and you look at your receipt, you really have to stop and think about all the bureaucratic maneuvering hidden in those prices and who is actually funding these trade wars.
It definitely changes how you look at a price tag.
Definitely. Well, thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the very messy reality of Tariff 2.0. We will keep tracking this 150-day countdown, and we'll see you next time.